Well, welcome back. I want to talk a little bit today about addendums and amendments. An addendum is something that's been added to an offer. You always use addendums when you're making an offer, but you want to modify that offer in some way, shape, or form. An amendment is you're amending or changing an existing contract between a buyer and the seller that already exists. So the buyer made an offer, you, the seller, accepted the offer. Terrific. Everybody is under contract. Now the parties want to make a change. Maybe it's they want to make a change because the seller doesn't want to make the repairs. So in lieu of repairs, they want to just offer the buyer some money. They're going to modify the contract and change the terms of the contract. But an addendum is something that is added to an offer when the buyer makes an offer to the seller. And what's important to understand is when it comes to addendums, the addendum rules. In other words, if there's language in the addendum that disagrees with the language that is in the offer to purchase, then the addendum rules, because the addendum means something was added to the offer. And so the addendum is going to override what the offer says. Some examples of addendums that you as a seller may see and you as a buyer may want to utilize is, for example, the additional provisions addendum. There are certain things that you might want to add that will be covered under the additional provisions addendum. There is the backup offer addendum. Maybe the seller is already under contract, but a buyer wants to make a backup offer. And in that case, they will include with their offer a backup contract or backup offer addendum. And that just simply puts them, assuming that you, the seller, accept their offer, then that buyer is now in backup position. And should the primary contract fall through, then the secondary buyer, the one that offer came in with the backup contract addendum, they will then move up to primary position. If the home was built prior to 1978, then by law, a lead-based addendum is required to be included as part of the offer. And if the home was built prior to 1978, the seller is required to complete a lead-based addendum, indicating whether they have had lead-based testing done, indicating whether they do or don't know whether they have lead-based paint, etc. Another addendum is the FHA-VA addendum. And I want to spend a little time on this one because it can be a little bit confusing. The FHA-VA addendum comes from the federal government because FHA, Federal Housing Administration, VA, Veterans Administration, do provide loans through banks if someone is getting an FHA loan or a VA loan. Veterans of war can get a VA loan, but anybody can get an FHA loan. Although the maximum amount that banks are allowed to lend under an FHA and VA loan are set to a maximum amount per county, anybody can get an FHA loan should they choose to. Under an FHA loan, the advantage of that, of allowing a buyer to make an FHA or VA offer, is that as the seller, you broaden the pool of buyers who are eligible to purchase your home. That is one of the advantages because it allows buyers who are getting an FHA or a VA loan to make an offer and purchase your home. So that's a great thing. The more buyers you have, then the more likelihood the seller will get an offer on their property. Although it's not a disadvantage per se, there is something to be aware of. Under FHA and VA, if the home does not appraise, even if the buyer is outside of the due diligence period, but the home did not appraise. And what I mean by that is the seller and the buyer agreed to go into contract for $150,000. That's what the buyer agreed to pay for the home. That's what the seller agreed to sell the home for, $150,000. But the house only appraised for $140,000. Now, banks will lend on the lesser of those two numbers. The bank's either going to lend on the $150,000 if the appraisal comes in higher, but if the appraisal comes in lower, then the bank is only going to lend on the lower amount. which means the buyer, if they still want to pay $150,000 for the house, then they're going to have to come up with more money out of pocket because the bank's only going to lend them based on the $140,000. The seller in that case could, if they chose to, come down to the $140,000 price and sell it for $140,000. The buyer and the seller could compromise, assuming the buyer has the extra cash and the buyer's lender is okay with it. They could compromise. The seller could come down $5,000, buyer could come up $5,000, seller could come up $3,000, seller could come down $7,000. So there are options available. But something to keep in mind is that if the home does not appraise, whereas normally once the due diligence period window for the buyer closes, then if the buyer walks away, they're not entitled to get their earnest money deposit back. However, if they are getting an FHA or VA loan and they utilize the FHA and VA addendum, then even if the due diligence period window has closed, whereas normally they would lose their earnest money deposit if they walked away, because the home did not appraise for the agreed to price and the buyer decides to back out, then in fact, the buyer can leave the contract because the home didn't appraise. And in that case, the earnest money, which is held in someone's trust account, whether it's the real estate firm's trust account or an attorney's trust account, then those monies, the earnest money deposit, will be returned to the buyer. Because under the FHA addendum, again, it added a change to the offer. And once the seller agreed to and accepted that offer, then that addendum became part of the contract, and the addendum overrides what the contract says. And since the FHA addendum says that if the home doesn't appraise, the buyer gets their money back, even if we're outside the due diligence period, the buyer can get their money back. Their earnest money deposit back. If the buyer put down a due diligence fee, the seller will still keep the due diligence fee because the buyer purchased time during the due diligence period and the right to walk away for any reason or no reason at all. And because the seller gave them that time and the buyer paid for that time, the buyer got what they wanted. They got their time. But the FHA VA addendum says even when that time closes, if the house doesn't appraise, then the buyer can get their earnest money deposit back. So just wanted to introduce this concept of addendums and amendments. Again, the addendum is something that's added to an offer, changes the offer, and becomes part of the contract once the buyer and the seller go under contract. An amendment is amending or changing an existing contract that will be done after the parties go under contract. And one thing I want to say about amendments is this. If you, the buyer, and you, the seller, are under contract, signed, sealed, delivered, communicated, an existing contract, and please see my video on how a contract is formed to find out more about that. Once the buyer and the seller are under contract, if at that point, one of the parties wants to amend or change the terms of the contract, it is their right to do that. But the other party is under no obligation to honor that. And if the other party does not honor that or ratify or change and agree to the change of the contract, then the original contract still stands. So let me give you a quick example before we wrap up. A buyer and the seller go under contract. The buyer says, I want you to replace the roof. Replace all the shingles on the roof. There's hail damage, replace all the shingles on the roof. And the seller says, fine, I agree to replace the roof shingles. Time goes on, they're under contract. Everybody's happy. But now the seller discovers that they're running out of time for whatever reason, and they don't have time to replace the shingles. Or they, for whatever reason, choose not to replace the shingles. Maybe they don't want to hear the hammering that's going on as those shingles are being replaced as they still live in the home. So they come back to the buyer with an amendment that says, in lieu of or instead of replacing the shingles, we would like to offer you $3,000. We'll just give you $3,000. Now, first of all, the buyer's lender is going to have to approve that. The buyer's lender is going to have to say to the buyer, yes, you are allowed to do that. Whether it's an FHA loan, VA loan, conventional loan, it doesn't matter. If they're getting a loan from bank, before the buyer can agree to those terms and those changes, their lender has to approve it. And if the lender doesn't approve it, then the buyer won't be able to get their loan. So in that case, if the buyer said, no, I don't want the $3,000, maybe they don't want it because the lender says they can't have it. Maybe they don't want it because they want the roof replaced. They don't want to have to deal with the hammering that goes on after they moved in. If the buyer refuses to agree to that amendment, that does not void the contract. What it means is the original contract still stands, which means the seller is obligated to repair and replace the shingles. So just a quick discussion on addendums and amendments. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon, and we'll talk about, I don't know, depends on which video you click on. Take care and have a great day.